Hello, and welcome to the Bitcoin Roundup podcast presented by Coinbits. We bring Bitcoin news, hot topics of conversation, and deep dives into a variety of Bitcoin topics to you weekly. We are Coinbits, a Bitcoin financial services company. Check us out at coinbits.app. This recording is for informational purposes only. No investment or legal or any other advice should be drawn from this content. And as always, consult an advisor before making any legal or financial decisions.
We'll go ahead and start. Allow me to just do a quick introduction here. So welcome everybody to Bitcoin Roundup Live, hosted by Coinbits. Today, we're honored to have two so far, but three eventually. Oh, here we go. We are honored to have three legendary Bitcoin plebs. Larry, founder of Equity Management Associates and a renowned Bitcoiner. Welcome. Glad to have you with us.
What's up, Larry?
I figured it out. My mic is on.
Here you go.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on plate.
No, appreciate you stopping by. We really appreciate your time. We also have Ben Prentice and Heavily Armed Clown. Now, all of these guys really don't need any introductions, but in case you're new around here, in case you haven't been around Bitcoin Twitter for a while, Ben and Heavily Armed Clown are behind what I personally consider to be the best nudge down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. The website WTF happened at 1971.com. If you haven't seen it, check it out. What I love about it is that you don't need to mention Bitcoin at all. And all of a sudden you've got someone following the yellow brick road that ultimately leads to orange brick road that ultimately leads to Bitcoin. So guys, sincerely, thank you for putting that together, and I'm glad to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's a funny reference that you use there, because isn't that whole what Wizard of Oz Yellow Brick Road about gold and people behind the curtain and
Yeah, exactly. Just another quick intro statement here. So if you guys don't mind, just to make sure that everybody is clear on kind of expectations of the space. So, quick intro here before we get into what happened in 1971. Coinbits is a Bitcoin only financial services company. Check us out, coinbits.app. I should also be clear that we have no business relationship or sponsorship or any kind of agreements with Larry, Ben, or Heavily Armed Clowns. They're just kind enough to join us tonight on this space. So we really appreciate that. We do this weekly, so be sure to join us every week if you're able to. Every time we talk about a different topic that's related to Bitcoin current events. Nothing discussed in this conversation constitutes investment, legal, tax, or other advice. We are not your advisors. This show is for informational purposes only. Before making any decisions, be sure to consult an advisor. Now, if your advisor isn't telling you to own some Bitcoin, what are you doing? Fire that person.
get another one.
But that's also not advice. This is for information purposes. Also, we're excited to be sponsoring BitBlock Boom, which takes place next week in Austin. Now, odds are if you don't already have a ticket, that chances are you're not going for any reason. But for some reason, if you're able to all of a sudden go, if you have some free time, if you have a hankering to talk Bitcoin and listen to Bitcoin only conversations, this is where you need to be. Tickets, last I checked, are still available for sale. So if you use the code Coinbits at checkout, you'll get a 10% discount. Also, these sessions take place with a ton of interaction. We want to keep doing that, and I'm sure many of you are here to, as well as listen. So, but I'm going to, for now, limit the number of speakers. I'd love to, you are here to listen more to Larry, Heavily Armed Clown, and Ben speak than me anyway. So we'll bring up additional speakers for discussion as needed. But for now, I just want to keep the speaker field low, and then we can take audience interaction later. For now, if you want to take questions, I'll keep an eye out on the comments field, which is in the bottom right of your screen on Spaces on Twitter Spaces screen. So if you have any questions, comments, throw them in there, and I'll keep an eye on it. So before getting started here down this conversation, thank you guys for your patience as I was making this housekeeping announcement. I'd like to start with a quote from the documentary Hard Money Film. If you haven't seen that, check it out. hardmoneyfilm.com. And the statement goes like this. The question is only rhetorical, like WTF happened in 1971. We're not asking because we know what happened in 1971, but do you? And that was a beautiful intro to the documentary. I don't know, Ben, that might have been your voice, or perhaps it's Heavily Armed Clown.
It was Clown.
Yeah, that's an opener. That's how you start a movie. The question for you guys: what is your motivation? What motivated you to start this? It's a ton of work. I'm sure you get your fair share of flack for it. So what is it to you? Why did you start it? Why do you continue to keep it up and the recognition you get for having running it?
Take it away.
Okay.
Anyone take that one? No, man. Yeah. So, I mean, we started this website not thinking it would be a big thing. We were arguing with, thin twit people about just like wealth inequality and all these things. We were doing a lot of research at the time too into monetary history. That the idea is that if you're trying to understand that Bitcoin is a better money, you have to understand that the old system was worse, why it was worse. And in theory, like so you learn about the gold standard when you learn about Bitcoin, and you learn that really not the period of 1944 to 1971 was like it's the closest thing we've had to a gold standard since. So when we went off the gold standard, intuition dictates that things should have gone worse. So I was doing research right around that time period, and heavily in our Clown and I we started like collecting all these charts, and we were arguing on Twitter and like finding all these charts, and we Clown and I just chatted all the time in the background, and I think it was kind of his idea. It was like, what if we website and ask the question, and then it would just like be a thing we could kind of point to. Instead of like trying to dig through our camera rolls and our phones and could constantly like show people the data, and then it would like kind of speak for itself. And, we never thought it would be a big thing, and it kind of got out of control, but it's just become a meme, and we love it.
We do too. You got me cracking up with the photos on your phone comment. I started a Bitcoin folder of like an album on my iPhone. I now have that album contain more pictures than pictures of my children. So I don't know what to make of it. Larry, let me pose you this question as kind of somebody who had been in gold and generally like monetary metals for a while. I'm sure you, before WTF happened in 1971, you were down this rabbit hole probably long before the website existed. What motivates you to keep talking and sharing the knowledge of the impact of fiat money, full fiat, that took place in 1971?
Yeah. So it's just a case of, I think our society has been ruined by fiat money. And, and it started even before 1971. It started with the Federal Reserve in 1913. The versions of the gold standard we had pre 1971, they weren't really perfect gold standard. I mean, Americans couldn't own it. All we really had was an international exchange standard up until 71, from 46 to 71. And of course, Roosevelt grabbed all the gold in 1934. So, but to me, sound money is actually kind of a spiritual and a religious issue. I mean, you either decide you're going to allow theft in a society, or you decide you're not. And if you decide you're not, and theft is a bad thing, then, not having honest weights and measures, i.e. having money that's flexible, as the Keynesians call it, is really a form of theft. And it just allows cotillionaires to skim off profits at the expense of honest, hardworking people who just want to earn money and save it. And it's no coincidence, as Ron Paul has said, that, the 20th century, a century of all out war, where in the 40s, we figured out how to slaughter, 20 or 30 million people in a great world war, was also the century of central banking. And, in fact, the central bank began just before we entered the first Great War in the early 1900s. And it was the central bank that immediately broke their charter in order to finance the First World War. And so one could make the argument that if we had a sound money standard, we would have many, many fewer wars. And in turn, we would also have less statism and less power residing at the state. And we'd have a fairer distribution of wealth than we currently have. I think one of the great charts that Ben and Clown have put on TF, 1971 is the productivity chart. It just shows how, think of all the things we've invented in the last 50 years and how much productivity has increased, obviously since the early 1900s, but also since 70. We ought to all be working 20-hour weeks and have higher and better lifestyles than our parents. And yet, we're all on a hamster treadmill, trying to keep the system going because we have to continually fuel growth and fuel it with debt. And, the people at the top are getting much richer and everyone else is struggling to stay alive. So, it's really, this is my buzz line on Twitter is fix the money, fix the world. I mean, until we return to a sound money standard, these problems are not going to go away. And so what Ben and Clown have done is really a fabulous public service by trying to educate people. I mean, Safe did the same thing with his book. And probably the best thing that's happened, I'm 65. I mean, I've been fighting this battle for 30 years. And what's really cool is to see, all these reinforcements come along, right? I mean, I've got 30-year-olds talking to me about von Mises and the Cantillon effect and all this other stuff, or 25-year-old. Where the hell did you come from? And, and where were you 20 years ago when I needed you? So, it's a great thing that's going on. And those of us who are gold money people first happened to be pre-2008. Your only choice was gold, but many of us now have migrated into Bitcoin and understand the advantages. And so, we feel like we've kind of got reinforcements here in this battle, which I really consider it's kind of the battle to restore the soul of the world. I mean, look, the average person want to go to foreign countries and kill other people. And yet somehow our country got hornswoggled into going and killing 3 million Vietnamese rice farmers. I mean, I was a kid at the time or teenager, but what the fuck, right? I mean, how did that happen? Happened because we gave these centralized states way too much power, and they used it to enrich themselves and the military industrial complex and so on and so forth. And the beauty of what's going on right now, in my opinion, is that the internet is basically disintermediated the news business. I mean, Joe Rogan is more trustworthy than the networks. And then the Bitcoin transition has basically taken the money away from the government. There's in the process of taking money away from the government. And so, these two things are going to fix this very broken system, but it's going to be painful. It already has, but frankly, it already has been painful. So, it's just, I think we can expect more pain until we resolve it. And we've got to resolve it on, as Greg Foss, my friend Greg Foss says, we got to resolve it for the kids and our grandkids, because otherwise, what the hell? I mean, what's the point? I mean, it can't go on the way it's going on right now. I realize it's kind of a lengthy answer, but I figured I'll just give you all of it at once.
Yeah.
Rather than in pieces.
What an awesome, really well said. I think we completely share, I think most Bitcoiners completely share your thoughts on that. And thank you for the awesome speech. I think the thing for us here is like you said, like this didn't start in 1971, right? This started, 1913 when, like you said, when we gave up rights to autonomy and money. And what I want to ask you guys, I don't know if you've given thought to this, really any one of you could take the lead on answering this. I'd love to get all your opinions. Practically speaking, right, because this didn't start with Nixon. Nixon kind of just happened to be the person in charge at the time. And I think, have to do kind of the best what he thought was best for the situation. Did he have another choice? What else could he have done? And then a follow-up question to that is, if any of you were in his position, what would you have done, given the limitations of kind of the fact that this is not something that he started? Obviously, it started well before that. But what other options did he have, and what else could have happened?
Sure. I mean, I'll let Ben and Clown jump in on that too. I just read the book on Nixon. I mean, look, Nixon didn't even realize or think about the moral or money implications of it. Nixon just wanted to get elected in 72. It was amazingly how, there's a good book I just read, 3 Days in August. It was kind of an insider's view. He interviewed the remaining people who were alive that were there and looked at kind of how the discussions went down. And, it was amazingly shallow on Nixon's part. He didn't think about sound money. He didn't think about future inflation. He didn't think about anything except how to get Richard Nixon elected in 72. And all he knew is that the monetary guys were saying to him, there's $40 billion of gold being demanded or foreign currency reserves outside us. There's $10 billion of gold in our vaults. If they ask for all of it, we're bankrupt. So you better shut the window now. And so he did that, and he tried to figure out how to sell it. And, John Connolly helped him do that. And they actually did it fairly. I mean, if you're going to be duplicitous, at least you want to be skillfully duplicitous. And they did a pretty good job of selling it, as these international speculators are taking all our gold and blah, blah, blah. And so, what they did was they shut the window, and that was that. And, it led to a decade of inflation, led to a lot of other problems. The answer to your second question, which is what could he have done or what should he have done? I mean, the reason they were in this position is because the U.S. government had gotten very irresponsible and was, the guns and butter policies of Johnson were financing the Vietnam War. We were running deficits that were much larger than had ever been run. And we also had a lot of social programs Johnson put in because he felt so guilty about so many other parts of his life. And as a result of those two things, people realized that the U.S. was financially unstable and the dollar was financially unsound. And we were taking advantage of the world by printing dollars to get goods and services. And so what they should have done is devalue gold in dollar terms and stayed with the gold standard, maintained the convertibility of gold into dollars, but balanced things out. The dollar would have been weaker. We imported more, imported less. And, the dollar would have been sounder on a going forward basis. And that was clearly the right thing to do. But it also would have shown weakness on our part that, we had to devalue our currency. And so, there was no way politically Nixon wanted to do that.
Good, interesting topic. I've never heard anybody speak about the possibility of devaluing our currency, but it sounds like even if he had done that, if that was the best option for the long term, that his short-term incentives were completely diametrically opposed to that option. And it's a concept that I think Saifedean popularized amongst Bitcoiners, although the concept existed before that, which is the concept of time term.
Exactly.
Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome
right.
type situation. And his primary responsibility to himself. We can't choose to
right.
again. Interesting.
Yeah, but it gets devalued because, listen, like the dollar being pegged to gold itself is a form of fiat, right? So there's inherent trust in that peg, and when like you said, governments get irresponsible, then you have to then reality comes in. The water goes out, and you get to see who's wearing the shorts. But that peg itself is a diktat. It's the government saying price of this gold is this, and the reality when ends up being more paper is that the real price comes about.
Well, when I say devalue, I don't mean devalue in terms of a set amount. I mean let gold float. Let gold find its natural price. And that they weren't willing to do that because they wouldn't have liked the outcome.
Larry, I'm curious. You doxed your age already, so I'm not sharing anything new here. But you were probably old enough, I think, to remember when that moment happened. And
I actually saw that speech live with my dad. We're watching a Detroit Tigers or a baseball game, and they interrupted the game to have him give that speech. And I was like, it was really weird. I remember it. That's really weird.
Take it back. Take us through the emotions. How did you guys feel about it?
Well,
Was it discussed?
Look, what was I? I was born in 57, so it was 71. So what was I, like 14 years old? I didn't know what it meant. I asked my dad what it meant, and I'm not sure he really knew what it meant either. My grandfather knew what it meant. He was like, we're going to have a shitload of inflation. And basically just, he's another Roosevelt. He just defaulted on the sound money concept of, the United States.
Wow.
We've talked to people too that around that same time that they also didn't really kind of that it was a big event because again, like a lot of people don't understand this stuff, but he remembered too that he said he was going to temporarily suspend the convertibility of dollar. And so it seemed like a temporary measure, but as we know, there's nothing so as a temporary government.
Well, that's right. And there were some other things he did around it. He put on a 10% tariff on all the foreign goods being sold to the U.S. And I mean, he really, they threw a bunch of rocks at all the foreigners. And I mean, I have to say, they're a bunch of evil guys, but if you read the book, I came away with a certain amount of awe of how really the way this was, but John Connolly pulled this thing off. Nixon would never have had any clue on how to do this or what to do. He was a smart guy in some respects, but he really didn't understand monetary economics at all. And Paul Volcker was actually the guy. Paul Volcker knew what we were doing was wrong, and he knew that they should have let gold float. But he also knew politically that was never going to happen. So his choices became, all right, if they're not going to let gold float, then we can either leave the window open and lose all our gold, or we can shut the window and hold on to our gold. And so Volcker said, you got to shut the window. And then once Connolly realized that was what was going to happen, then he came in, he stepped in and said, okay, if that's how we're going to do it, rather than make us look like we're doing something wrong, we got to blame it on the foreigners like they're doing something wrong. They're trying to beggar their neighbor by selling us all their stuff cheap, which really wasn't true. I mean, we were getting all our stuff cheap because we were printing dollars, but he put it as their problem and said, okay, we're going to start taxing the shit out of all your imports into us. And until you guys open your markets, we're pissed off. And he did have a little bit of a leg to stand on there because the Japanese were very closed. I mean, we've never been able to really import things into Japan, and the Japanese were really, being very protectionist, in their trade with us. But I mean, that's where Connolly said, it's our currency, but it's your problem, which was
Yeah.
really a ballsy thing to do.
Larry, Connolly later filed for personal bankruptcy. That financial mastermind was
I didn't realize that.
so
Yeah.
smart that he later filed for personal bankruptcy.
I did not know that. I'm not sure he was that smart financially, but politically, the guy was an animal. I mean, he really, this would not, Nixon wouldn't have been able to pull this off nearly the way he did without Connolly helping him.
Really interesting hearing kind of the perspective of how things evolved. As you were saying this, I was wondering if we're going to look back at 2020, which during the time, I think most of the population just had no idea what hit them. Like a moment like we tweeted about today with there's infinite cash at the federal. I wonder if that is going to be a 1971 moment, in 50 years time, where it's like, we'll look back on it and say, wow, that was a moment where things really got more screwed up than they had.
Yeah, there are going to be a lot of touch points. I mean, I think the Ben Bernanke 1982 helicopter money speech, where he said deflation is not going to happen here. I mean, that's going to be in the history books right beside John Law, because that's what basically kicked it all off. And then the 2008 financial crisis, where they bailed out, all the bankers, and it was socialism for the rich, and the wives of the Morgan Stanley executives got to borrow money to buy assets on the cheap, and all the other nonsense. I mean, that'll be another touch point. And then the PPP and all the money that got sent out, as a result of COVID. I mean, it's just, there's another one. I mean, it's stunning. I mean, I know many business people who had very successful businesses that were not threatened at all by COVID, and yet they got huge checks they did not need. And so that was the test run for for
UBI.
UBI. Yes, thank you. I was looking for that term. Thank you, saved me. Yeah, that was the test run for UBI. And so that's you can kind of see where we're going. I mean, I'm pretty sure that Biden is going to forgive all the student loans right before the election, so he gets all those votes. And you see where we're going. I mean, there are no sound money people in the House, except for Bitcoiners.
Yeah, it's like your grandpa was in 1971. You see that nonsense. I want to ask you guys, of all things that we all know that things started to head far south in 1971 as a result of this decoupling. Which of the categories of the things that were impacted, I'll list them in a second, do you think is most meaningful, and why? So we have, I'm just going through the WTF happened in 1971.com website, which everybody should bookmark. The Orange Pill people, by the way, bookmark this website. You use it for sure. Categories of things that have changed. So real compensation, cost of living, food, politics, education, the number of current crashes and banking crises across the world, investing changed drastically, energy, healthcare, a bunch of social aspects like marriage, divorce, living with parents, incarceration rates, etc. All these categories, what do you guys think is the most meaningful category that has impacted us most meaningfully, and why? And heavily armed clown, you haven't spoken much. We'll start with you.
Oh, one definitely the ones about wealth inequality, like anything you're talking about the Gini coefficient or income inequality. And the answer to that is really simple. It's just because the most bloody revolutions that have ever happened in history, like communist revolutions, Bolshevik revolution, they never happen in well-to-do countries. They're always peasant uprisings that happen. Typically, they're politically controlled by some sort of ruling academic elite. And they're usually designed as some sort of way to redirect the force of disgruntled peasantry that's living at or beneath a subsistence living. So anytime you see that type of stratification and wealth concentration across society, which we have seen in particular, in the last 50 years in this country, thanks in no part, to the thanks not least of all, to the monetary policy, also just to the more so blatant disregard for personal private property rights and the erosion of free market capitalism, in the sense that, I don't know. I need to be kind of careful because America has a long history of federal government marriage with big business and corporatism and socializing input costs and those types of things. But like generally speaking, the wealth inequality is worse now than it's ever been and has been doing so in the last 50 years. And that's what primes populations for disgustingly bloody, horribly violent revolutions. And that's really like what the elephant in the room is that everybody should be talking about, to be quite honest.
Yeah, it's no wonder then you guys start the website, because I was thinking to myself, like, why do you put the charts in the order that you do? And I guess that's why you're starting with the most impactful first. Ben, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say that actually those were the charts that really ended up like putting the nail in the coffin of us really like solidifying this thesis that, we found a few of these charts, but then like the wealth inequality charts, I think really speak to people too. But, as Clown points out, it's kind of more of a foreshadowing. And as Larry kind of outlined in his like opening monologue thing, that this is a problem of unsound money that it's harder to understand for folks. Like it's harder to explain because you have to understand that because they're so bad at storing value, we'll store our value in everything else. And that, when a good becomes a money, it acquires a monetary premium, a value above the like commodity use value of the thing. And that's what assets got today. The equities, and in real estate too, they really become partial monies, quasi monies in the Austrian terminology, such that the folks that can afford to have assets as part of their liquid portfolio, then they get to benefit from inflation, whilst the poorest among us, they can barely hold money in their bank account, and the money is obviously susceptible to inflation. So the asset inflation problem and the problem of also monetizing things that shouldn't be monetized, that only get monetized because the money is bad, also changes the price signals of those things and makes things worse too. So yeah, the wealth inequality piece, I think is hard. It's hard to explain, and it's hard for folks to kind of grasp onto. That's why we have so many charts to kind of show different parts of that story. But no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's right. I mean, that's the biggest visible thing. I think the slightly less visible, but the more pervading effect of unsound money is what there's a great interview by Grant Williams and Tony Devin that, when you have unsound money, it's a lie. And the money is the base layer of information in society. And so if you base your society on a lie, you're effectively rewarding liars. And so you're going to get an amoral society. You're going to get, an opioid drug problem. You're going to get wars that you shouldn't have. You're going to get a industrial complex. You're going to get, people that have money bending the society in a way so that the rules favor them. And it just, and what it leads to is people being demoralized, feeling like they're on a treadmill. And sadly, most Americans can't focus on this issue because they're just trying to put food on the table. And that's a constant challenge. And so, it doesn't leave any time for leisure. It doesn't leave, nobody can retire. I mean, how can you retire when you don't know if your savings are going to last for the remaining year of life because they're being debased on a daily basis? So it just completely turns society on its head, when you have unsound money. I mean, and so, we are all significantly poorer, live in a harsher society, live in a much, in a socially much more difficult society than we should be living in as a result of what the people at the top have done to the money. And so, the 3 million dead Vietnamese, ask the family in the Midwest that has lost their son or daughter to opioid addiction, all these various things, they've all come as a result of unsound money. We could have, that's why I feel it's so important to fight for it, because, we could have so much, we've got so many benefits. Humans are so hardworking and so intuitive and so smart, and we can solve problems. We can solve this energy problem. We get nuclear power. There's no problem that we can't solve, but you've got to have a fair system, or else people are going to say, fuck it, I don't want to participate. And, and you're seeing that. And that's sad. They're going to get demoralized, and they're going to do drugs, or they're going to, whatever, or they're going to go on shooting rampages because they don't think they have a future. I mean, it's tragic, and it's all because of the politicians who have perpetuated a system that is completely and utterly broken. And none of them have any clue. I shouldn't say none. Very few of them have any clue that it's all because the base layer of the money is broken. The only politician I've really seen who understood this, and I ran a couple of ads for him when he ran for president, was Ron Paul. And, frankly, I mean, I'll never forget, he was up on the stage with Rudy Giuliani, and Giuliani mocked him. And, it was one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen. So, we've got to fix the money. It's that important. It's the most important thing for every single one of us in our lives today, is to fix the money. And that's why I'm very sympathetic to Bitcoin maxis who, take this shit like it's life and death, because it is. It actually is life and death for our kids. And so anyone wants to criticize Bitcoin or, attack Bitcoin, they're my enemies. I mean, I'll go after them tooth and nail, because they're wrong. Keynesians are wrong. So
Really well said. Really well said. Having never gone by.
I'd like to change my answer. So I actually think that the most important chart on the whole website is total public debt. And the reason for that is because historically, monetary policy is always downstream of fiscal policy, particularly like where this is particularly evident is the most major reforms in U.S. monetary policy have been during times of war when there's fiscal crisis. The Barbary Coast Wars, the Quasi Wars, the War of 1812, the Civil War in particular, which was the advent of the first irredeemable paper money in the United States, which was the greenback. World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, and then on and on and on into the War on Terror and the forever wars of today, right? Really, in my mind, like when you look at that total public debt chart, and it just looks like the Burj Khalifa, and there's almost no seeing the top of it, because it's so impossible to comprehend. To me, what that demonstrates, and I hate to admit this as an American, like my pride hates to admit this, but I have a little bit of nationalism in my heart. What it demonstrates to me is a failure of the Constitution to actually rein in ability of the government to expand its access to money and credit. And this is not a new problem, right? Like this goes all the way back to the decade following the founding of this country. Like the very first government purchase of public debt securities was in 1792 and was authorized by Alexander Hamilton, and it was $150,000. And at the time, that was a lot of money. And that was organized by a New York financier named William Sutton. And really, it's the marriage of fiscal irresponsibility at the government level with private enterprise and private interests. And you can like read all about this. Like if you go read Rothbard's History of Money and Banking, like you can read all about this, go study like what the railroad tycoons, like the railroad tycoons that were worth considerable fortunes on paper and didn't even own any track or any rail cars. All those types of types of speculative booms that we see today, they're all induced by government manipulating the access, really the cost of capital, government manipulating the cost of capital, and or subsidizing input costs of entrepreneurship. So at a glance, like most people won't notice why that's so important, but I would think that fiscal policy is definitely the most important thing, because monetary policy is always downstream of fiscal policy. And you have to have a balanced budget if you want to have a sound money. Or you have to take the ability of government to infinitely expand access to money and credit. You have to stop that somehow. And that's really like what 1971 represents, is the United States government finally figured out how to have unhinged, unchecked expansion of money and credit at its leisure.
That's well said. I agree with that.
Because Ben, you came off mute. If you wanted to share a thought, go for it.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that, the Keynesians are so scared of deflation, and the main reason they're scared of deflation is because of this Burj Khalifa of debt that, the clowns pointed out, that the reason that we're scared of prices going down. This is insanity. Ask anybody on the street, hey, would like prices to go down, right? How many of them? No. Get them going up higher. What the fuck is wrong with you, right? Like The reason they're scared of price number go down, is because of the debt. That's the only reason. And the debt is the result of the inflation, and the inflation is a result of the broken money. So that's it's when you understand incentives, you understand the outcome.
For sure, for sure. Really, really well said. I want to tie everything you guys said together. I think the biggest thing for us regular Bitcoin, perhaps having done as much research into these topics as you guys, is how to bring this to the everyday person. And I think the hardest thing to connect, and really anybody who spent time in the Bitcoin rabbit hole, the hard thing to do is to connect the topic of Bitcoin to everyday life for the normal person. And I think what WTF happened in 1971.com really does is help draw that bridge. We are, as Larry said, diehards for Bitcoin because it matters that much. People don't see why it matters that much, or come along for the journey and explain to them the connection between money and society, money and capital, money and the wealth inequality, the difference in the wealth gap, and people running on a treadmill, people not being able to retire, people not being able to afford college anymore. And so what this website does, at least for us in conversations we've had with non-Bitcoiners, is it helps us draw that bridge. Here's how hard money fixes this. Here's why things that are broken in society are broken today. And here's where it started. And here's data to support it if you're a data person, right? So it's a good way to convince people. But on that topic, I want to ask you guys about a specific chart. So you've all, I'm sure, orange pilled, gold pilled, maybe at some point before Bitcoin, people using perhaps some of this data. I'm curious specifically which charts riles people up the most, is the best conversation starter for trying to perhaps orange pill. What is the one chart? Like if you had, if the website gets taken down tomorrow, hopefully it doesn't, hopefully it's up forever. But as a reminder to us of this big mistake in human history. But if there's only one chart that you would use, it sounds like heavily on clown. It sounds like yours would be the debt going to the moon chart. Larry, Ben, do you guys have another choice of one chart that you would use to show?
I have one. It's about 20% of the way down. The title of it's U.S. net wealth shares, and this is a chart from Ray Dalio's work, and it shows the richest richest 0.1% versus the bottom 90%. And he's circled like two major periods. And this is kind of building off the conversation that was had previously regarding the wealth inequality, that shows that when you get extreme wealth inequality, you basically get a populace. So this is, Lawrence was talking about how unsound money, it basically, it disaligns the incentives of society, and society just like left floundering to kind of, go do opioids or whatever. And what you get is people getting pissed off about why things aren't. That's the main thing, right? It's like, it's not that, if you look back 100 years or 200 years, like, yes, life is a lot better in general because of deflation, by the way, not because of like, politics or whatever. It's because of deflation. It's because you have access to, cheap technologies. You have access to, so for less man hours input, we can get out of those things, right? That's deflation. That's a good thing. When you don't have that progress, people look around and they look at the inequality. They look at the folks that are getting better, the richest people that don't need it as much as we do, or as younger, or as less wealthy people do, and they get pissed off. And that's the emergence of populism. And it's no surprise that the first one was right around 1929 when the Federal Reserve money the first time. Now, the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, and then one of the worst economic disasters, monetary economic disasters in history, if not the worst, 1929. That sparked this terrible period of populism just afterward, and there was all sorts of price controls and all these terrible things that FDR did, as Lawrence was talking about earlier too. And we're seeing it happen again now. That's the point of this. The second circle is now. It's that things are getting so disaligned, and as Clown kind of was alluding to this earlier, but that really that's where we're headed, guys. Like that's why you see crazier and crazier politicians all throughout the world. It's not just here. It's just all throughout the world because people just want change, right? Remember Obama, he ran on this platform of just change, right? Like that's what they're getting elected on. Is like, I'll give you anything. And the worst part is because they have the unsound money, they can promise anything. They don't have to worry about the bill, right? Like, oh yeah, what do you guys want with that? Okay, I can pay for that. Don't worry about it. How do you pay for it? Don't worry about it. Easy, right? So the incentives are not. So that's scary. I think it's just scary too.
For sure, for sure. I just tweeted and pinned it if that's the one that you're talking about, Ben. And by the way, the three of you guys
Yeah,
speakers,
that's
feel
it.
free to pin. You could share any tweets you'd want to the space so that it's all to look at it in real time. Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the productivity chart is the biggest one. I mean, I think it just the way it shows, you know what I'm talking about, where it shows how productivity has gone up and the average wage has not gone up. I think that really, I think what the biggest portion of the world is frustrated with is we've got all these great economic developments or technological developments, which should have made our lives significantly better, and yet, frankly, our lives are worse than they were in '71. And it's kind of like, what the fuck? I mean,
But the
that's the
TVs are
website.
cheaper, Lawrence. The TVs are cheaper, so it's all
Right. Okay, great. But you only buy one TV and it lasts for 10 years. So that doesn't really solve the bigger problem, right? You got to eat every day, you got to drive a car, you got to have health care, and so, this to me, that's the biggest one. The other one I would point to is the one at the top of my pinned tweet on Twitter, which is just that, there's and this is Greg Foss's point too. There's a mathematical issue here. If you have to increase debt in order to create growth, eventually the debt gets so large and the GDP growth doesn't keep up, that something's got to give and it's going to collapse. And that's what I was talking, we're basically at that point where we're going to have another sovereign debt crisis because, we just can't pay back all the debt we've taken on. And so it's kind of time for Jubilee. And this is all really driven by the Keynesian notion that growth is good, that growth at any cost is good. And that's a flawed notion. What we really, first of all, we've got a limited sized planet, right? And so, if growth at any cost is good, well, we're going to destroy the planet. And so growth isn't what we need. What we need is efficiency. We need more for less. Productivity is what's good. Real measure that we should be looking at. But Keynes, reacted to what he saw in his time, which was the Great Depression, where there wasn't enough demand and there was a lot of unemployment. And that's because they wouldn't let wage prices clear and they did a lot of stupid programs. But leaving all that aside, he reacted to that and said, well, we need to kindle animal spirits. In order to kindle animal spirits, we need the government to get involved. And the government, and by the way, that's going to give the government a lot of power. And by the way, Keynes and his whole set, they all love the notion of the government having a lot of power because that means they're in power. And so, Nancy Pelosi's of the world, they love the fact that they have the power that they have and they can be great inside traders. So, it all is of a sort that's for those at the top of the pyramid. But for the rest of us, we're getting fucked. And so, we basically got to take away the toys from these people. And that's what Bitcoin's going to do. I mean, and that's why it's so exciting and so powerful and why Bitcoiners are so hopeful, and rightfully so. But the nasty part is that, unfortunately the other side has a lot of tools. They still somewhat control the narrative. They certainly can mess with things. I mean, I was shocked at how much people fell for the COVID lie. And so, it's going to take time. But I think, look, I've known that the government is broken and corrupt for a long time, and I think, a lot of the country knew it. And as an example, I mean, I've known that the CIA killed Kennedy since I was, 18 years old. I mean, you do any amount of research and you come to that conclusion. But, I would bet that a large piece of this country, particularly older people, don't understand that or believe that. And yet it's true. And so, people have got to get educated. And thankfully, this younger generation isn't stupid and they are getting educated and they're all going to come to the conclusion that this is just intolerable. And very much the way the revolutionary, people in colonial America said, these British guys, this is just intolerable. We're not going to take this shit anymore. And the thing that's funny is if you read the history of that period carefully, and I've done it, it wasn't like the whole country was against Britain. There were a lot of loyalists. I mean, I have friends today whose relatives were actually on the loyalist side and they lost property, they lost all kinds of things. But, it was just a small group of people that were really pissed off and said, right, we're going to fight it. And they changed the world. Yeah, it took time, but, and so this is going to take time to happen. because, we've got the wind at our back and we've got a much better hand. I mean, the other side is playing a losing hand in a big way. So, it's pretty optimistic about it all, but, that doesn't mean it's not going to be a struggle, but we can have fun with the struggle. And, that's what the memes are for. And that's why we all stick together. And, it's going to work. And looking back historically, I mean, I know which side I want to be on. I know I want my grandkids saying, hey, shit, that old fart, he figured it out, and I don't want to be on the other side of it. And so, the word will spread. I mean, look, 80 or 90% of this country knows that things are broken, right? The perfect example of that, by the way, 80% of this country wants term limits, yet we don't have term limits. Why is that? It's because the people who control the system don't want term limits. So we need to overthrow those people, and we will. But it's education. So I think the job incumbent upon all of us is to spread the word, in as positive and kind a manner as we can, recognizing that there are people who are misguided, that, unless they're actually hostile toward Bitcoin, we should try to work to convert everybody to become a Bitcoiner. And they will, once they see all, and they learn and they understand, you get them there. I mean, I've orange pilled 60 bucks. I mean, and by the way, gold bugs are half the way there anyway, because a lot of them know the money's broken, the system's corrupt. They were just afraid, they were just they look at Terra Luna, or they look at the shit coin. They're like, hey, this is all bullshit. And they're right. And so you just need to convince them that, that Bitcoin it stands alone. It's completely different. So I don't know. That's all I've got to say on the topic, but it's happening. The good news is it's happening.
Yeah, no, amazing. I think, Larry, you got to join us every Thursday night if you got nothing to do. Just
I don't have time. I mean, I'm not trying to be snooty. I'd love to, but I mean, I've gotten busy. This shit's kind of crazy. I mean, I'm getting a lot of DM. I mean,
Bitcoin fixes this, man. Bitcoin
yeah,
fixes
well,
this.
maybe, I don't know. Maybe I need more people helping me out, because if I'm not responding to anybody, please don't take it personally. I'm actually on vacation this week, but I wanted to get on this call, and I do the best I can with what I got in terms of time. So
No, it's really kind of you to join. We definitely appreciate your input. One thing you said that got me thinking, and I think it was either Ben or Heavily Armed Clown that had mentioned this before, and maybe you piggybacked off of them, but it was about the people in charge wanting things to continue. And I think it's something in Saifedean's book that really put the bow on this. But it's about humanity and human history, everybody fighting to get access to the money printer. Like, the closer you are to the money printer, the more access you have to it, the better off you are. And this is something in human nature that has to do with just a limited planet, limited time on Earth. And that's what it's about. And so as long as we have a money printer to be accessed, people will always fight to get access to it. Joining us is my himself, Saifedean. Thank you for joining, Saif. You're a little bit late to the conversation, but I'll catch you up. Nixon screwed us over, all of us. Not news to you. But on that topic of access to the money printer, you guys touched on this a little bit in your parts. Of all the federal government members here, at least in the US, what % of those people do you think actually understand our monetary system? Actually understand what happened in 1971? Actually understand its impact on the people that they govern or represent? Would you say it's 25%?
Less than
more?
1%.
yeah, this is Larry. I'll go first. It's zero. It's zero.
I don't know about it being zero. I mean, like, if they're, let me play kind of steelman, perhaps the opposite, opposite argument. I mean, we've got some, high ranking members in Congress who understand Bitcoin, right? And so it's hard to understand Bitcoin, I think, without really understanding broader monetary history and economics. And that's why the Bitcoin standard, I think, is such a light bulb for so many people. But someone like Cynthia Lummis, perhaps, right? Or someone, like Warren Davidson. I know, like, Warren is more local. He's not federal government per se in Congress. I think there are a few here and there, but I guess it's clearly not an overwhelming majority, or perhaps any kind of majority at all. But is that number changing? Do you think Bitcoin acts as kind of a forcing function for both regular people as well as people in power, people who are politicians, the powers that be, to learn to understand monetary economics and history and that aspect?
No, Bitcoin is antithetical to the United States government and the ways in which it operates. It is a poison pill to those people and their livelihoods and their pensions. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Like I don't see it any differently than that. And I don't think you can see it any differently than that, because the United States government is insolvent. And if it can no longer expand money and credit, it can no longer pay its bills. And Bitcoin is the wrench in those gears that will destroy that system. And anybody that understands the monetary system of the United States stops working for the federal government, because they know the federal government is bankrupt. And they know that the federal government can't make good on the promises that it's made to its constituencies in the form of public debt. And it's only a matter of time before those promises come home to roost, and those checks will bounce.
Yeah, but I'd say Bitcoin teaches people, because if you're going to hold Bitcoin, you're forced to ask very, very deep questions about, well, why is everybody else wrong? Am I really right? And I think you'll hear this story over and over again. Most Bitcoiners, they question everything all the time, over and over again, to make sure that they really, and it forces you to, as a holder of Bitcoin, as a user of Bitcoin, to kind of question everything, because it is not mainstream yet. And as it becomes more mainstream, I guess less and less will have to do that. But, there's less and less reward to adopting it later and later. And then you just get to hold good money afterward. And that's totally a good reward too.
Yeah, for sure. I think the one tie-in here to kind of back to Bitcoin, right, is let's say, there's different opinions and different thoughts. I know, say, if your opinion on this specifically has changed through the years, and actually I think you say that in writing the fiat, your opinion has changed on this. But let me ask you guys this, and anybody can jump in here. Maybe Saif, we'll start with you on this question. In the future, right? And I don't think any of us here think that we're going to wake up one day ourselves without a government and some kind of an capitalist society all of a sudden, right? That might change over time, but we're not going to wake up one day and find ourselves there. So for the foreseeable future, at least, we're going to have some kind of governance structure, right? And can what happened with gold, in the dollar, fractional reserve banking, does that happen to a few governments on a Bitcoin standard? And I ask this because ultimately, and right now, what's happening, especially in the market today, is technically fractional reserve Bitcoining, right? Like I have no valid explanation for why any exchange can say we're going under, we can't give you the Bitcoin that we owe you, right? That is fractions of Bitcoin. Can this happen? And we know governments aren't going away overnight. Can this happen to a future government Bitcoin standard? Saif, what are your thoughts?
I don't. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I think, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, so I don't really know what's going to happen. But I think, like, the point that I try and make in the fiat standard is that Bitcoin's fighting chance is not just that it is harder than gold, as I say in the Bitcoin standard, is that it is also faster than gold and much cheaper to verify than gold. Basically, I try and summarize the argument in terms of the cost of running a full node. Basically, if you want to run a full node for gold, part of the business expenses is being able to take on and defeat the United States Army, which is a little bit expensive, much more expensive than running a Bitcoin full node. A couple of $100, and you can verify any transaction from anybody to anybody else and not have to trust anyone. You can audit the whole code, you can run it on your own hardware, and you can basically have the ability to do what a gold central bank can do, which doesn't exist today. I mean, I don't dwell much on this in the Bitcoin standard or the fiat standard, how we got to this point where there just isn't a gold central bank anywhere. It's not possible for, imagine you're in a country that's suffering from inflation right now, in Venezuela or in Lebanon or in Zimbabwe, and you're trying to, import stuff for your business, export things. You can't just find a gold bank that goes around your central bank and says, hey, we're just going to have a gold shipment business and we're going to open a line of credit and we're going to have branches all over the world. And people in China can, if they want to get paid from people in Lebanon, they go to that Lebanese gold bank in China or any Chinese gold bank. And then you can just route around fiat. It doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is that it's illegal one way or the other. these things are, I mean, and it's not very clear how this happens. And this is where, like there have been attempts to do something like this, like the Liberty Reserve dollar, and they got shut down. Not clear entirely whether this was truly that they were doing something illegal or whether it was just the Federal Reserve shutting down competition or the US government shutting down dollar competition. But the bottom line is you just can't do global clearance with gold today. If I wanted to trade my gold when I was in Lebanon to send it abroad, the only way that I could have done it is to carry it out on an airplane. And I think there's an increment of you have to do it. I think a maximum of maybe $5,000 or $10,000, depends on the country, but something like that per trip. So you have to go back and forth on an airplane to try and get your money out of the country in gold. So that can be done with gold because ultimately you have to have centralized clearance, and it has to be, because of economies of scale, you have to have the clearance centralized, and because it has to be centralized, then you've got to have something that's physically vulnerable, very easy to capture by governments, which is not the case with Bitcoin because sure, they can do fractional reserve banking, as you said. A lot of people can get into, places where they give their Bitcoin and think they have access to their Bitcoin, but then it's not, Bitcoin is rehypothecated. But none of that matters to me or to my node. Nobody can force my node to accept Bitcoin IOUs like Bitcoin. With the next block, when the next block comes about, you can't sneak in a transaction with Bitcoin IOUs on chain. At the end of the day, there's this exact number of coins that's going to be accounted for every single 10 minutes. There's Pierre Rochard sitting there counting them every single 10 minutes and making sure, everybody agrees on which accounts hold which exact UTXOs. And you just have with gold, obviously. And it means that no matter what happens, they can build all of the same scams that were done on gold, all of the fiat bullshit that was built on top of gold can be built on Bitcoin. But the difference is that it will always be voluntary. It'll never be able to monopolize Bitcoin. It'll never be able to capture Bitcoin. That's the thing. So yeah, suckers will lose their money to Mashinskis. There will be many bigger Mashinsky to come. And there will be a lot of Celsiuses and a lot of shitcoins and a lot of stupid scams and a lot of Ethereums and a lot of BitConnects. We're going to get all of these we're going to get them at the next levels. They're all going to be 10x larger. Instead of having a bunch of nerds on Twitter, we're going to be having nation states and central banks and large financial institutions making the next shitcoins and dumping them on people and calling us toxic. So that stuff is going to happen. But my node continues to not give a shit. That's not possible with gold. With gold, you just can't go route around all of that bullshit and say, you know what, 1 ounce of gold is 1 ounce of gold anywhere in the world. And I'm just going to use this money. And, I don't care about what the central bank does. I'm just going to use my gold node. Doesn't work.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on this too. I 100% agree, Saif. We talk a lot about, when we talk about what the fuck happened in 1971, is that gold, the story of 1971 is the story, in my opinion, of the failure of gold as a monetary technology. And if you want to try to figure out, like, when did gold start failing, you look at the bank failure. We're talking about fractional reserve banks, them not having enough to cover their deposits. Well, when did that start happening? It was in the 1800s. And this is a concept I thought about a lot. Recently, Lynn articulated very well. Lynn Alden's in the audience. Love her work. And she articulated that the same thing that Saif said at the beginning of his talk there is that gold, the information basically started moving more quickly than the gold could move at all. And when that started happening, we started using paper as a scaling technology on top of the gold. And that brought some benefits because paper was faster and lighter and eventually led to digital paper. And that was very fast. But it also came with some drawbacks, as we well know, leading eventually to 1971. So I just wanted to highlight that speed of Bitcoin, because what Saif is talking about, basically, we have a lot of lessons to learn. That's what I got from what Saif is. We have a lot of lessons to learn, and you don't need banks to move Bitcoin around. So we have to learn as a society why Bitcoin is important and that people need to actually hold the Bitcoin themselves and use Bitcoin on the base layer in order to avoid catastrophe.
I
Yeah,
would add,
good.
I would add that Federal Reserve kind of gets a bad rap in sound money circles because all lending is fractional reserve. Lending has to be fractional reserve. But the problem is, or the reason that it's confusing for most people is because money warehouse lending kind of became obfuscated. The line between those blurred. And that line was blurred primarily by state-sanctioned suspension of redemption of specie at financial institutions throughout all of American economic history. So like in that sense, like 1971 was really a precedent that had been set time and time again throughout many fiscal and economic crises throughout the United States' history, which was just the suspension of the redemption of specie. Or, if you're thinking about it in terms of networks, settlement to the base layer, which was like gold bars. And what Saif is really getting at here is that process of the arrest of settlement to the base layer of money, that suspension of redemption of specie can't happen with Bitcoin because of the Pierre Rochard's routes and auditing the numbers and settling to the base layer. And the financial we are the financial institutions of Bitcoin. Everybody that uses Bitcoin and holds their own UTXOs and runs their own full node and audits the supply and validates the Bitcoin that they receive, that they are the money warehouses and the lenders and the financial institutions.
But clown, let me disagree with you on a couple of points. I'm not entirely convinced that we actually need fractional reserve lending. I come at this from a more Lephardian point of view. And in true classical economics, I mean, my sense is that, investment capital should be equal to savings capital. And that, the minute you introduce fractional reserve, you create a whole new set of problems. And that's a long discussion that we don't need to have here. I agree with actually everything Saif said with one small exception. And I think one error that some Bitcoiners sometimes make, and that is by assuming we can see the chain, we know where all the coins are on the chain. We feel like, okay, that's a level of security that you don't have with gold, because who knows who has how much gold, and Fort Knox isn't there, and blah, blah, blah. You can't settle it. You can't move it. I mean, we all know Bitcoin's, 1,000% better. But here's the thing. There are Bitcoin derivatives out there. And the thing to keep in mind in the derivative, folks, is that he who has the biggest balance sheet can win, because it's like table stake poker. If you've got more money than everybody else at the table and nobody can call your bet, you effectively control the market. And so one thing I think is rather important here, and right now, and in the gold market, that what this has meant is that, there are 1,000 claims, between 100 and 1,000 claims in the world on every existing ounce of gold, in my estimation, based on trading volumes, a lot of data, and having watched this thing for 30 years. And so, that's why the gold market is so heavily manipulated. And that's why, if we went back to trying to back the money standard with gold, the money supply with gold would be $80,000 an ounce, and that's not, which shows you how much debasement there's been. So, but the point is that governments did this intentionally over a period of time, and they did it with an asset that didn't do a 5x in 3 months. So they had the ability to absorb whatever losses they would take, or to, write them off balance sheet because it was a national security issue, and they were running it through accounts in the Cayman Islands. And right now there are, by Glassnode's estimates, there are about $6 billion worth of Bitcoin futures and derivatives in the world, which compared to what it trades every day is not a big number. And so, the futures market is not controlling the Bitcoin price today. But you have to remember, we all know what a real coin is. We all know what owning the keys are. We all know, how important that is. But the price gets set at the margin, and that if somebody comes in and wants to create a bunch of paper Bitcoin and sell it into the futures market, to think that the futures market is not going to affect the spot market is naive. And so things that's got to happen here when we refine and get further down the road and fix this monetary system and Bitcoiners and the government is we've got to ban derivatives. Because if we don't ban derivatives, some government, whether it be China, Russia, us, whoever, is going to figure out how to control the futures market for Bitcoin. And it's going to be the tail wagging the dog, just like gold. So,
No, sorry, Lawrence. I disagree. You can't ban trading. It's going to find a way. Markets find a way. And if Bitcoin can be killed by derivatives, well, then it deserves to die. But it can't, and it won't, because you can have international settlement of Bitcoin outside of government structures. That's the thing. What Clown was saying about it I agree with you on fractional reserve banking not being needed on Bitcoin, but I agree with him that really Bitcoiners who run their nodes are the sovereigns in this. They are the ones who call the shots. And it still hasn't sunk in for the fiat idiot world because they've gone through a century in which right and wrong don't matter. Truth doesn't matter. No counting entry. Everything is made up. That show with Drew Carey, what was it called? Whose line is it anyway? Where the lines are
Points
made up
don't
and the
matter.
points don't matter. Exactly. That's fiat. And I think this is how the world runs. And they just think that it's hard for people to just get around the fact that stupid fucking game is over. We are not running on a stupid system where the scoreboard is made up by Keynesian fucking morons. That we don't have just running a scoreboard. We have an actual scoreboard that reflects what goes on in reality. And you have people running their nodes, and they can take their Bitcoin anywhere they want, and they can send it, and they can receive it, and the market for Bitcoin continues to grow. So the ability of somebody to say, all right, you have Bitcoin derivatives and Bitcoin IOUs as alternatives for Bitcoin is zero because they can't force your node to take it. And that's where the difference is with gold. They could first force you to use a paper that was backed by gold, but be backed by gold because you have alternatives. But with Bitcoin, you do.
Yeah,
I'd
I'm
also-
not sure. I'm not sure I see
go
the
ahead.
distinction though, Saif. I mean, as long as there are people, I mean, you're right. You don't have to accept paper Bitcoin, and I don't have to accept paper Bitcoin. But if paper Bitcoin exists in markets, and a certain percentage of the people in the world accept it as being real Bitcoin, what makes it different than gold? I mean, it's the same problem, isn't it?
I can explain this easily. So during the Civil War in America, when the United States federal government was issuing green, there was actually an arbitrage between paper currency and gold currency. And it was extremely obvious to everybody at the time that the problem was the paper money, that there wasn't any type of complex economic supply chain interaction between the bread coming from the field to table. It was just the fact that the paper was worth the same, at par, at mark to market as the gold currencies were. So people realized that they could spend the physical commodity and get more for their dollar, literally, than the paper greenbacks that were issued by the government. It will be no different with Bitcoin. The reason is just because it breaks down that wall of misunderstanding that the layman has about how money and credit actually works in the marketplace. If you can see it happen in real time, then there's nothing to misunderstand. And that's basically what Bitcoin enables.
And that's the other thing. He said, like, price is set at the margin. Just really quickly, the price is set at the margin. Yes, that's true. And Bitcoin is undergoing a monetization phase. What you want is Bitcoin to be the most liquid good in the world where it trades everywhere. And then that problem becomes not a problem because then Bitcoin is traded everywhere and the price is set everywhere all the time.
Yeah, and ultimately the difference is that if they do impose any of those things, the liquidity will increase for people who have real Bitcoin. Ultimately these things fall apart. All right, the price declines. There's a crash when Celsius crashes, but the people who are not playing these Celsius games, they're the ones who are able to stack the cheap Celsius coins at this point. And so they end up benefiting from this because you can't lock the market down as you could during under the gold standard, because under the gold standard or with gold trading, ultimately the only place where you can settle, the only place where you can cash out your chips is the house. So you have to take your gold chips. I mean, and this is the thing, like gold is all run in the LBMA. So if you're dealing with any kind of appreciable sum of gold beyond the coins, we're talking about where we go beyond just individual savings and start thinking about serious money, you're just playing with tokens on the LBMA, which is all controlled by governments. And so whatever is going to happen in that market, they can shut it down when push comes to shove. They can force people to take derivatives. They can get central banks to sell. Central banks still control. I think this is really the other thing that doesn't get mentioned. Central banks own about 1/6 of the world's gold. So they have an ability to set prices. They control the clearance and they are major hodlers. So the equivalent in the case of Bitcoin would be if central banks owned about 4 million Bitcoins. They're about 4 million Bitcoin away from that. And 4 million Bitcoin currently is about $100 billion. So, I don't see central banks ponying up $100 billion to buy Bitcoin anytime soon. And by the time they are going to be considering $100 billion, I think that's not going to be anywhere near buy you a sixth altcoin. So I don't see it as being similar to gold. I think we have a much better chance.
Well, one way you have a better chance is that, gold has never gone up 5x in 4 months like Bitcoin did in 2020. I mean, they've got their hands full, but you can be pretty sure, I think, that when that occurred, alarm bells went off in, the monetary world. And, I just having watched them operate in the gold space for 30 years, I don't put anything past them. I really don't. And, they've got their guys, they've got, Bankman-Fried, and they've got, BlackRock getting into the game now, et cetera, et cetera. And, I hope you're right, Safe. I mean, I'm rooting for you to be completely right, but I'm somewhat fearful that until we get control of the government and outlaw derivatives, we've got a risk that's very real to us.
Yeah, I would be inclined to think that all these noises recently and maybe some of the action that we see in the market has BlackRock behind it. I mean, clearly they're curious about everything and they need to buy everything. They're buying family homes all over America. I'm sure they're into Bitcoin. And yeah, I think somebody like Sam, the FTX seems like kind of a decent front for this kind of operation. The way that they usually operate in industries is that they just come in with all the cheap credit and just buy up everything. And so coming in at this time when, the bear market is decimating a lot of the businesses allows FTX to make all this money. And the curious thing here is that, I think everybody I know who's in the Bitcoin space has heard about FTX from essentially fiat world. You first heard about FTX from the New York Times or from some fiat magazine or something like that. We don't know people who got wrecked on FTX or who made money on FTX. We have decades of folklore now, almost, about people getting wrecked on Bit and Poloniex and people getting rugged on all kinds of different exchanges that live in our folklore. And like the long-lasting exchanges, if you're in the Bitcoin space, you've heard about people that have gotten into that change. You've heard user experiences, that people who didn't enjoy it. FTX just showed up out of nowhere with basically no clients, and suddenly Fiat World was just telling us this is the biggest company. They bought a stadium or whatever it was at that point. And I don't see how they could have been so successful in the crypto industry when very few of us had known of them. I remember the first time I'd heard about it was when a journalist had contacted me asking me they'd want to interview me about this. And I had to Google the person they wanted to interview me about because I had no idea who it was.
Yeah, the FTX case is very suspicious. And, I don't put anything past these people. I don't.
Yeah, I think the future of this is obviously yet to play out, and we haven't seen the full future of how we're going to transition to a Bitcoin standard just yet. But I think one thing is clear, right? We're not going to go without a fight, and that's why, Larry, your opening monologue to the spaces is just so spot on. I mean, if we don't fight for this, we're in essence repeating the mistakes that happened in 1971. And in 1935 or 34 and in 1913. And we're no better than any of the people who stood idly by as their future was robbed away through fiat banking and through the fiat money standard that we're living in. One thing I wanted to touch base on that I think ties really well, the conversation we've had thus far, and maybe Ben, you can speak to this from your research on what happened in 1971. Is the idea of fiat science and fiat fuel. And the two really go hand in hand, right? So specifically how fiat science affects fiat nutrition and goes into the food industrial complex, as well as the energy crisis that we see all over the world today. I mean, all the building blocks that have been built since 1971 lead us to this moment we're in today. And Larry, you've been around long enough to see oil go up and down, and the infrastructure that we need to have in order to preserve fossil fuels kind of just decay over time, and through fiat politics just doesn't, we don't have enough energy. We're not producing as much energy as we could. So it'd be really good to hear your perspectives. I mean, maybe Ben, you could start us off with the data that you guys have on WTF happened in 1971.com with regards to perhaps energy use and how that has changed over time.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to be humble because there's literally Saifedean literally has written a book about this concept. But I mean, the last chart on our website is a chart about meat consumption and how there was like a replacement effect where, I think as prices of things went up, chicken was very like, it had a lot of like ability to deeper with like more industrial farming practices to like combat inflation, where other meats, better meats for you, didn't have that. So you saw a replacement effect there. You could go all the way back to 1933 when money got very unsound, and they were like burning crops and, destroying things to change the prices of them. The story of unsound money is a story of misaligned incentives, as we've been saying this entire time. And the further you get away from those things, the more expensive you make the things that we really literally need to live, food, just the more you debase society itself. That's what inflation is, and we'll always replace to other things that are cheaper, whether they're good for us or not. And then you can add in the whole libertarian angle. FDA has just been one of the worst organizations. The food pyramid. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So I'll stop there because there's literally, like I said, people that have written books on this different stage. So.
Well, Ben, your input was valuable. I think before Saif, I'd like you to take this question next. But before Saif, I give you the floor. One of the things that absolutely blew my mind away, as I was putting together a Twitter thread on about a week ago, it's the revisions of the CPI as time went on. And the Bureau of Labor Services has this up on their website. I don't look at this stuff, but this statistic blew my mind. This literal verbatim that I'm going to read to you guys is, I think it was in 1987, they literally updated the CPI to, between 1987 and 1988, they updated the CPI, and I quote, "New sample procedure to prevent overweighing us whose prices are likely to rise." That is verbatim. And I guess you were saying that about the cost of just basic necessities going up. I mean, they literally changed CPI to reflect this change. Here, I'll ping this tweet thread for anybody who hasn't seen it, but it's insane. It's just complete voodoo science that's driving this. Saif, what are your thoughts?
So I got some stuff to do. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stick around much longer, but it was great chatting. Take care, everyone.
No problem. Thank you, Saif.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah. So the point is, like, it goes back to the incentive structure, and the clear thing that has taken place since 1971, since going kind of full fiat, the incentives are just completely upside down, and it's all about who you know and how close you are to that freshly printed new money supply, and how quickly you can get your hands on it. So it's driving literally everything. Hey, just to close us out here, I know we've been going for a while, and Larry, Ben, Heavily on Cloud, you guys have been with us for pretty much the entire time. I really do appreciate your time. What can the everyday pleb, right, the people that are on this call, all of us, what can we do to further this knowledge? What can we realistically do, practically do to drive knowledge forward and get people to know this truth and really drive this change forward?
I'll take that first, and I got to hop off too. So I have a stack of the Bitcoin Standard books in my house, and I just give that out to everybody who expresses any interest in Bitcoin. The other thing, I put a thread up on it recently. It's not just enough to convince people to hodl it. I think we got to get people using it. And so I did a thread a while back. I think others have done this as well. Every chance I get, I try to pay people in Bitcoin, and I help them download a Mun wallet, and I do a Lightning transfer, and just send them $1, or if they'll accept full payment for a service, I'll pay them that way. And then I just talk about it to no end. And of course, that drives my wife nuts because she says I'm socially unacceptable in certain circles. But, you just you got to spread the word, right? If you believe in something strongly, you got to spread the word. And it's a small, passionate group of people, I think, that what is going to make the difference. So that's what I've done. And then of course I shit post all over Twitter and, crap reserve 24/7 because nobody should respect these people. They should be humiliated, denigrated, the whole 9 yards. I mean, it's what they've done to us is incredibly bad. And as a result of that, we should be fighting back. So with that, I'm actually going to sign off too. I've got an early schedule. I guess what stuff I got to do. So, but it was really great being with everybody. I enjoyed it. It was awesome that Safe joined. And I really enjoyed learning his perspective on the strength of the Bitcoin in terms of fighting off the manipulation. I hope he's right. I fear he's not, but I hope he's right. I'll say good night to everybody.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate it. Yeah,
problem.
keep posting those workouts. We're
See y'all. Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Ben, Heavily Armed Clown, any kind of final thoughts on how we can further this mission? How can webs share this knowledge, and how can we, do you guys have an intended use, I guess, for WTF happened in 1971? How do you imagine people using it?
I like to use it just as a way to start a conversation, but I use it more so as a filter because I tend to not enjoy discussing these topics with people who either aren't interested in listening or, if they don't know anything about it, I expect them to mostly listen and or ask questions. And if they don't meet that criteria, like if this stuff, I just don't like to talk about this with people who pretend like they understand it when they don't, because it doesn't help anybody. So it makes them look dumb and it makes me annoyed. So I would say the best thing that you can do is to read real books, not like editorialized books, nothing that's been written in like the last 50 years with the exception, or probably the last 30 years, with the exception of like, the Bitcoin Standard, like by Safe or some of the more recent work, like by some of the Austrian guys, like maybe like Hans Hermann Hoppe. But go and read Rothbard, go and read HAC, go and read I got my start by reading Ron Paul's And the Fed. And that book totally changed the way that I looked at the whole world and set me down a rabbit hole of Austrian economics. And I've probably read dozens of books by half a dozen plus, probably at least a dozen different authors at this point. Very, very, very smart people. Rothbard has no intellectual match in my mind, and all of his books are excellent. But as far as like what to use the meme for, I think it's really great to like start conversations. Like you just show it to someone and you say, hey, like, have you seen this? What do you think happened? And if you look around the internet, that's really what it does best, is that it just kind of gets people talking. And, smart people understand that you can't control or dictate what people think, but you can certainly steer what they think about. And I think that that's one of the most powerful things of our meme, is that we've managed to kind of keep it a little bit ambiguous. If you dig, our biases are there for sure, but on the surface level, it's really good for just getting a bunch of people on Reddit angry. And when people are angry, they start talking. And when they start talking, sometimes those conversations are fruitful. And maybe they lead to orange pilling 1 out of every 100 people who sees it. Maybe it's even less than that. But even if the conversion rate's really low, it's still a useful tool for just getting the conversation moving.
Yeah, I'll kind of close out by echoing what Clown said and also repeating stuff that he said previously. You can't do the work for people, and you kind of got to meet people where they are. And like you said, that kind of reaching that 1% or that 10% or whatever, that's the goal. You're not going to be able to reach 90% of the people you interact with at all. Like, give up on that. And you got to understand that, like, for me anyways, my perspective at this point, is that yes, I do try to talk about Bitcoin whenever I can, but I'm not gonna stand and yell till I'm blue in the face on a soapbox about it. I try to learn these little kind of quips, like, Meadowell's like line, I think Bitcoin is the best money, and more people start to realize that the price should go up. Like things like that, when it comes up in conversation, when they find out you're the Bitcoin guy, when they find out you work with Bitcoin or you like Bitcoin, and they're like, well, what's the deal with that? I heard it's down right now. Just like tossing out one of those little quotes. And then if it sparks a conversation, you can go on that. But like, I think you start stuffing it down people's throats, they automatically, they turn on their Keynesian default ideas, and it's too hard. Clown said you should read Austrian and all these other, yes, you should. But also, like, if somebody's actually interested, show them those books, because it's hard to argue those points from those books, even if you read them well and you understand them well. Like it's so much easier. They actually just read it themselves. If they're actually curious enough to do the work, you can't do the work for people. Again, to paraphrase Heavily Armed Cloud. So just show them the door, get your links together. One of my favorite resources to give people besides our website or kind of beyond our website, because our website is really just a taste, is the coin-resources.com, which is run by Derek Gigi. Got millions of things, every kind of podcast, article, book, everything under the sun. It's got all the best ones, perfectly curated by Gigi. Bitcoin-resources.com. There's lots of things like that. That's the one I use. It's easy to remember. And, just show people the way and be ready when they are interested. But don't be the crazy. Don't be Dan. Don't be Dan. Be you. So that's all I want to say on that.
Awesome. What are we close about? There is no substitute for proof of work. You can't learn things for people. You can only show them the way and guide them as they go on that journey. What a way to finish an awesome conversation. I can't thank you guys enough, Ben, Heavily Armed Cloud. Everybody on the space right now needs to go and follow WTF_1971 on Twitter. They've got a pin tweet there with the merch store. Support these guys. That website, WTFhappened1971.com. is amazing. Really good way to start off these conversations, as both Ben and Heavily Armed Cloud have done. For those who may not know, Ben is actually the producer at the What Bitcoin Did podcast. Follow the podcast. They have 2, 3, 4 sometimes shows a week, and they're often the first podcast that there's listening to. So support them. They cover Bitcoin only, and Ben does great work. So shout out to Ben for that. Thank you enough for this awesome conversation. We're Check out Coinbits. Coinbits is a great way to introduce your family and friends to Bitcoin without having them, quote unquote, invest in Bitcoin. You have a DCA service, and we also have a Roundup app. So check us out, Coinbits.app. And we do these conversations every Thursday night. So Ben, Heavily Armed Cloud, you guys always have a seat with us if you're willing to drop in and you're kind of bored on a Thursday night after a long week of work. You're always welcome to join in and have a conversation with us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us, man.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. And I'll talk to you again all next week.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Bitcoin Roundup podcast presented by Coinbits. So what do you think of the conversation? Share your thoughts with us on Twitter @CoinbitsApp. And be sure to subscribe to be notified of our next episode release. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time on the Bitcoin Roundup podcast.